In the sprawling ranch lands of 1882 Wyoming, where fortunes were built on cattle and broken dreams, Bo Buckshot Remington had everything a man could want, except peace. The wealthiest rancher in 3 counties he'd earned his gold through, grit and gunpowder, but success had left him hollow as an old mine shaft. When a group of railroad barons decided to play a cruel game, they delivered what they called entertainment to his doorstep. Sierra Lane, a once famous saloon singer, now reduced to silence by trauma. They expected Bo to use her like the others had, then discard her when the novelty wore thin. But what those city men didn't understand about Bo Remington was this: wealth hadn't made him cruel, it had made him lonely. And sometimes the loneliest. Souls recognize each other across the deepest wounds. What happens when a man who has everything meets a woman who has lost it all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Remington Ranch in shades of amber and gold, stretching across 20,000 acres of prime Wyoming grazing land. Bo stood on his wraparound porch, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching his cattle dot the distant hillsides like scattered pepper. At 42, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into prairie wind and harsh sun. The ranch house itself told the story of a man who'd built something substantial from nothing. 3 stories of solid timber and stone, with hand-carved railings and windows that caught the light just so. Inside, polished hardwood floors gleamed beneath Persian rugs and oil paintings. Of Western landscapes hung in gilded frames. Bo had spared no expense, driven by a need to prove that a poor ranch hand's son could build something worthy of respect. But this morning, like so many others, the grandeur felt hollow. The silence pressed against him, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of wood settling in the morning warmth. He pulled his father's gold pocket watch from his vest, a habit that had become ritual in the 3 years since Margaret and Emma died. 6:30. Another day stretched ahead, full of tasks that no longer held meaning. "Morning, boss." Jake. Morrison's voice carried across the yard as the ranch foreman approached, hat in hand. At 60, Jake had worked the Remington spread longer than anyone, his loyalty earned through shared hardships and mutual respect. His leathery face bore the permanent squint of a man who'd spent his life outdoors, and his bow-legged walk spoke of decades in the saddle. "Jake." Bo nodded, grateful for the interruption. "How are the herd counts looking?" "Good numbers. That new bull's been earning his keep. Got near 30 calves this spring." Jake paused, studying Bo's face with the familiarity of an old friend. "You sleep any last night?" Bo's laugh held no humor. "Sleep's overrated." He drained his coffee cup, the bitter liquid doing little to wash away the taste of another restless night. The dreams still came. Margaret's laughter echoing through empty rooms, Emma's small hand in his as they walked to the creek. 3 years, and the ghosts remained. As vivid as yesterday, the fever had taken them both within a week. Margaret first, then little Emma, as Bo helplessly watched the 2 lights of his life dim and fade. The finest doctors in Wyoming territory couldn't save them, despite all his wealth and influence. Money, he'd learned, meant nothing when death. "Who came calling?" "Boss, you got visitors coming up the road." Jake's voice pulled Bo from his dark thoughts. A dust cloud rose in the distance, marking the approach of a covered wagon, flanked by 2 riders. Bo recognized the lead horseman immediately. Cornelius Whitmore, one of the railroad barons who frequented the gentlemen's clubs in Cheyenne. A soft man with soft hands and hard eyes, who treated people like pieces on a chessboard. Beside him rode his associate, Fletcher Danes, equally well-dressed and equally untrustworthy. The wagon drew to a halt in front of the porch, and Whitmore dismounted with the careful movements of a man unaccustomed to the saddle. His expensive suit was already dusty from the ride, his face flushed beneath his bowler hat. "Remington!" Whitmore called out, his voice carrying the false heartiness of a man conducting business. "Magnificent morning, isn't it?" Bo set down his coffee cup, every instinct warning him to be wary. "Whitmore, what brings you out to honest country?" "Why, we've brought you a gift." Whitmore's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "A token of appreciation for your reputation." Fletcher climbed down from the wagon's driver's seat and moved to the back, untying the canvas cover. Bo's stomach clenched as he glimpsed what lay within. A woman, huddled in the wagon bed like discarded cargo, gentlemen. Bo's voice carried ice. "I believe you've taken a wrong turn." Now, Remington, don't be hasty." Whitmore's eyes glittered with amusement. "This is Sierra Lane. Perhaps you've heard of her? The Denver Nightingale. They called her, sang in all the finest establishments." The woman looked up at the sound of her name, and Bo felt something twist in his chest. Even from a distance, he could see the hollow look in her dark eyes, the careful way she held herself, as if expecting another blow. Her auburn hair hung, entangled waves around a face that might have been beautiful, if not for the haunted expression that marked her features. "She's had some difficulties," Whitmore continued, his tone casual as if discussing livestock. "Lost her voice, fell on hard times. We thought a man of your particular appetites might find her entertaining." Bo's hands clenched into fists. "Get off my land! Come now, don't be ungrateful." Fletcher spoke for the first time, his nasal voice grating. "We heard you've been lonely since your wife's passing. Thought you might enjoy some companionship. The kind that don't talk back," Whitmore added with a chuckle. "Perfect for a man who likes his women manageable." Bo stepped down from the porch, his movements deliberate and controlled. Both men took an involuntary step backward as they recognized the dangerous stillness that preceded violence. "You seem to have mistaken me for someone else," Bo said quietly. "I don't traffic in human misery." "Oh, but you do." Whitmore's confidence returned, bolstered by distance and his companion's presence. "Your reputation precedes you, Remington. The ruthless cattle baron who takes what he wants and asks no questions. We thought you'd appreciate the convenience." "Sierra." Lane stirred in the wagon, attempting to sit up straighter. Her dress, once fine, now torn and stained, hung loosely on her frame, speaking of weight lost to hardship. When she looked at Bo, he saw not just fear, but a terrible resignation, as if she'd already accepted whatever fate awaited her. "Help her down," Bo commanded. Fletcher hesitated. "Now see here. Help her down." Each word carried weight, and Fletcher quickly complied, offering his hand to Sierra as she climbed from the wagon with careful dignity. She stood on unsteady legs, clutching a small bundle to her chest, her only possessions, Bo realized. The morning light revealed the full extent of her condition. Too thin, bruised shadows under her eyes, and an invisible shroud of trauma that seemed to weigh her down. "There's been a misunderstanding," Bo said, never taking his eyes off Sierra. "Miss Lane is welcome to stay as long as she wishes, as an honored guest." Whitmore's face darkened. "Guest? See here, Remington." "Jake." Bo's voice cut through the morning air. "Escort these gentlemen off my property." The foreman stepped forward, his weathered hand resting on the gun at his hip. "You heard the boss." Whitmore's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. "This isn't over, Remington. We'll be back to collect our investment. You do that." Bo's smile held no warmth. "I'll be waiting." The two men climbed back onto their horses. Whitmore's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "1 month," he called as they rode away. "We'll be back in 1 month to see how you've enjoyed our gift." Their laughter echoed across the prairie. As they disappeared into their own dust cloud, leaving Bo alone with Sierra and the weight of an impossible situation. Sierra hadn't moved from where Fletcher had left her, still clutching her bundle with white-knuckled hands. Up close, Bo could see she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with fine features marred by exhaustion. And fear Miss Lane. He kept his voice gentle, the way he might approach a spooked horse. "You're safe here." She studied his face with eyes that had seen too much, searching for signs of deception or cruelty. When she found neither, something in her posture relaxed fractionally. "Jake will show you to the guest room," Bo continued. "There's a lock on the door, and you're free to use it. No one will bother you here." For a moment, Sierra's lips parted as if she might speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she nodded once, a brief dip of her chin that somehow conveyed more gratitude than words ever could. As Jake led her toward the house, Bo noticed something poking from her bundle. Torn sheet music, the edges yellowed and frayed. Music, from her old life, carried like a talisman through whatever hell she'd endured. Bo stood in his yard, long after they'd disappeared inside, his father's pocket watch ticking steadily in his vest. For the first time in 3 years, the silence didn't feel quite so oppressive. Someone else breathed in his house now, someone who understood loss in ways that most people never would. He thought of Whitmore's laughter, of the casual cruelty in Fletcher's eyes, and felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with loneliness. It was anger, yes, but also something else, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Margaret and Emma's graves had been filled with Wyoming earth. Inside the house, Jake was explaining the layout to Sierra in his patient, grandfatherly way. Bo could hear his voice drifting through the open windows, offering comfort to someone who'd clearly had little of it lately. The guest room occupied the house's east wing, with windows facing the sunrise and its own private entrance. Margaret had designed it for visiting family that never came, but now it would serve a different purpose. Sierra would have space to heal, to find her voice again, literally and figuratively. Bo climbed the porch steps, his boots echoing on the wooden planks. Inside, the house felt different already, less like a mausoleum, more like a home. It was a dangerous feeling, this stirring of hope, but he found himself unwilling to push it away. Whatever game Whitmore and his associates were playing, they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd assumed Bo Remington was the same man who'd built his fortune, through ruthless determination and casual violence. What they didn't understand was that losing everything had changed him in ways that wealth never could. He was still dangerous, perhaps more so now than ever, but his capacity for cruelty had died with his family, replaced by something harder to define but no less powerful. Call it wisdom, or simply the bone-deep understanding that some things mattered more than reputation or pride. Sierra Lane had been delivered to his doorstep as a test of his character. What Whitmore would discover in time was that Bo Remington intended to pass that test, not by taking what was offered, but by protecting what had been broken. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the shadows that had clung to the ranch house eaves. Somewhere inside, Sierra was seeing her room for the first time, perhaps allowing herself to believe that safety might be more than just a cruel joke. Bo pulled out his father's watch again, noting the passage of time with something approaching satisfaction. For once, the hours ahead held possibility instead of emptiness. It was a start, small, fragile, but real. And sometimes in the Wyoming territory of 1882, a start was all a person could ask for. 3 days passed in careful silence. Sierra moved through the house like a ghost, accepting the meals Bo's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, prepared, but eating little, staying mostly in her room, except for brief ventures to the kitchen or the front porch when she thought no one was watching. Bo found himself adjusting his routines to accommodate her presence, taking his coffee earlier to avoid startling her, speaking more quietly to Jake when they discussed ranch business, leaving fresh wildflowers outside her door each morning. Without explanation, on the 4th morning, Bo discovered her in the stable. He'd risen before dawn to check on a mare expected to foal, moving quietly through the pre-dawn darkness with the practiced ease of a man who knew every inch of his property. The stable doors stood slightly ajar, lamplight spilling through the gap in golden slivers. Bo paused, hand resting on the weathered wood, listening to a sound he hadn't heard in years. someone humming, so softly it was barely audible above. The horse's gentle movements. Through the gap, he saw Sierra kneeling beside the pregnant mare, her auburn hair falling loose around her shoulders. She'd traded her torn dress for a simple work shirt and riding skirt that Mrs. Chen must have found somewhere, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked less like a broken doll and more like a woman finding her footing. The mare, a gentle bay named Rosie, stood calmly as Sierra examined her swollen belly with surprising expertise. Her hands moved with confidence, checking for signs of imminent labor with the skill of someone who understood horses in their bones. "Easy, girl," Sierra whispered, her voice rough from disuse but carrying genuine warmth. "Not quite time yet, is it?" Bo stepped through the doorway, deliberately scuffing his boots to announce his presence. Sierra's head snapped up, and for a moment fear flickered across her features before recognition settled in. "Miss Lane," he kept his voice gentle. "Couldn't sleep either." She shook her head, rising slowly to her feet. In the lamplight, he could see the exhaustion that lined her face, but also something else, a spark of interest, of engagement with the world around her. "She's close," Sierra said, the words barely audible. "The foal. Maybe another day or two." Bo moved closer, noting how Rosie remained calm under Sierra's touch while shying away from most strangers. "You know horses." It wasn't a question, and Sierra seemed to recognize that. She nodded, running her hand along Rosie's neck with the unconscious affection of someone who'd found solace in the company of animals. "My father," she said, each word carefully formed. Before everything. He trained horses, racing stock, mostly. It was the most she'd spoken since arriving, and Bo felt something shift between them. Not trust, exactly, but the possibility of it. "Would you like to help with the birth?" he asked. "When the time comes." Sierra's eyes widened, and for a moment he glimpsed the woman she'd been before trauma stole her voice and confidence. Yes. If I wouldn't be in the way, you wouldn't be." Bo meant it. "Rosie seems to like you. That's worth more than all the veterinary training in the territory." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the mare nose through, her hay with the patient contentment of an expectant mother. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. "Miss Lane," Bo said carefully, "what happened to you before you came here? You don't owe me explanations, but if you ever want to talk about it..." Sierra's hand stilled on Rosie's neck. When she looked at Bo, her dark eyes held depths of pain that made his chest tighten. "Vincent Cray," she said, the name dropping like a stone into still water. He said he loved me." Bo waited, sensing that words were coming that had been locked away for too long. "I was singing at the Denver Opera House," Sierra continued, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. "He came to every performance, sent flowers, wrote letters, so charming, so attentive." Her laugh held no humor. "I was foolish enough to believe him, to think that someone like him could truly care for someone like me, a nobody from Kansas with nothing but a voice." The story emerged in fragments, painted in halting words and long silences. Vincent Cray, heir to a mining fortune, had pursued Sierra with the single-minded intensity of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. When she finally accepted his proposal, she thought she'd found her fairy tale ending. The wedding was planned for December, Sierra said, her voice growing distant. "I was so happy, so stupidly, blindly happy." She'd discovered the truth 3 weeks before the ceremony. Cray didn't love her. He owned her, or thought he did. The opera house where she sang, the boarding house where she lived, even the dress shop where she bought her gowns, all secretly funded by Cray's money, creating an illusion of independence while ensuring her complete dependence on his generosity. When I confronted him, Sierra's voice dropped to a whisper. He laughed, said, "I should be grateful that women like me were meant to be kept, not to make decisions." Bo's hands clenched into fists, but he remained silent, letting her find her own pace. I tried to leave. Packed my things, planned to take the morning train back to Kansas. Sierra's breath caught. He was waiting in my room when I returned from my final performance. The attack had been swift and vicious. Cray's rage at her defiance had stripped away his civilized facade, revealing the monster beneath. He'd beaten her, violated her, and when she screamed for help, he damaged her throat in ways that stole not just her voice, but her livelihood. He told everyone I'd run away, Sierra said, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. That I was unstable, ungrateful. When I couldn't sing anymore, the opera house let me go. The boarding house evicted me. Every door that had been open suddenly slammed shut. She'd ended up in the gambling halls and saloons, not as a singer, but as a serving girl, invisible and broken. When debt and desperation finally cornered her completely, Cray had reappeared, not to rescue her, but to complete her destruction by selling her to men who saw women as nothing more than entertainment. And that's how I ended up in that wagon, Sierra finished, her voice barely audible. Broken goods passed from one man to another like livestock. Bo stood motionless, rage burning in his chest like a forge fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the controlled fury of a man who'd learned to channel violence into purpose. He's wrong, Bo said quietly. About what you are, about what you're worth. Sierra looked at him with eyes that wanted to believe, but had been disappointed too many times. You're not broken, Bo continued, moving slowly to the small bench against the stable wall. From his vest, he drew his father's pocket watch, then did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He removed Margaret's wedding ring from his finger. The gold band caught the lamplight as he held it up, studying the simple inscription inside. Forever and always, M. My wife gave me this ring on our wedding day, Bo said softly. I've worn it every day since she died, like a chain around my heart. Couldn't let go, couldn't move forward, couldn't even imagine a life without the weight of that grief. Sierra watched, transfixed, as Bo carefully placed the ring in a small wooden box on the workbench. You're not the only one who's been broken, Miss Lane, but maybe broken doesn't have to mean destroyed. The gesture hung between them, like a bridge spanning a chasm. Bo had made himself vulnerable in a way he hadn't attempted since Margaret's death, offering not just kindness, but the possibility of something deeper. I don't know how to trust anymore, Sierra whispered. Neither do I, Bo admitted, but I'd like to learn again, if you're willing to try. Outside, the dawn chorus began, meadowlarks and finches greeting the sunrise with songs that spoke of renewal and hope. Inside the stable, 2 wounded souls stood on the threshold of something that might in time become healing. Rosie whickered softly, nudging Sierra's shoulder with gentle insistence. The mare's trust, freely given, seemed to ease something in. Sierra's expression. Vincent said I was worthless without my voice, Sierra said, her hand moving to her throat. That no one would ever want damaged goods. Vincent Cray, Bo said, is a fool, and if he ever comes near you again, he'll discover that some men don't take kindly to those who hurt the innocent. The promise in his voice was iron hard and absolutely certain. Sierra searched his face and found only sincerity, no false pity, no calculated kindness, just the steady strength of a man who'd learned that protecting others was sometimes the only way to heal yourself. I should go, Sierra said, but without the desperate urgency that had marked her earlier attempts to flee. Those men, they'll come back. I don't want to bring trouble to your house. Let them come, Bo said simply. This is your home now. For as long as you want it to be. The words settled between them with the weight of a vow. Sierra's eyes filled with tears, not of pain this time, but of something that might eventually become gratitude. As they left the stable together, the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. Behind them, Rosie continued her patient wait for new life to enter the world, and in the growing light of morning, 2 people who'd lost everything began the careful work of learning to hope again. The days that followed brought a gentle rhythm to the ranch that Bo hadn't experienced since Margaret's time. Sierra emerged from her shell like a wildflower after rain, slowly, carefully, but with unmistakable life stirring beneath the surface. She took to helping with the horses naturally, her intuitive understanding of their moods and needs-making. Her invaluable during the busy spring season, Bo found himself looking forward to their morning conversations in the stable, where Sierra's voice grew stronger each day. She never spoke for long stretches, but her words carried weight, chosen carefully and delivered with the precision of someone who'd learned to value language after losing it. "She's ready," Sierra announced on a Tuesday morning, her hand resting on Rosie's flank. The mare had been restless all night, pacing her stall and nickering softly to anyone who'd listen. Bo nodded, already moving to gather the supplies they'd need. Over the past week, he and Sierra had prepared methodically for this moment. Clean towels, sharp knives, medicinal herbs that Mrs. Chen had insisted were essential for a safe delivery. "You've done this before," Bo observed, as Sierra guided Rosie. To the birthing stall they'd prepared with fresh straw and soft blankets. "Many times." Sierra's voice carried the first note of confidence he'd heard from her. "Papa always said I had gentle hands, that the mares trusted me because I understood their fear." The labor progressed smoothly under Sierra's careful guidance. She spoke to Rosie in low, soothing tones, her hands never harsh or hurried as she helped position the foal for delivery. Bo found himself watching Sierra more than the horse, marveling at the transformation. This was the woman she'd been before Vincent Cray, competent, caring, unafraid to take charge when her expertise was needed. When the foal finally emerged, a perfect bay filly with white markings on her face and legs, Sierra's quiet gasp of wonder made Bo's chest tighten with emotions he'd thought buried forever. "She's beautiful," Sierra whispered, tears streaming down her face as the filly took her first shaky steps. "Absolutely perfect." "What should we call her?" Bo asked, though something in Sierra's expression suggested she already had a name in mind. "Hope," Sierra said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope." That evening, Bo pulled out his father's leather journal from the study where it had gathered dust for years. The worn pages contained cattle drive stories, sketches of landscapes, and most importantly, his father's thoughts on honor, integrity, and treating all living things with respect. He found Sierra on the front porch, watching the sunset paint, the sky in shades of purple and gold. She'd been spending more time outdoors lately, as if rediscovering her place in the world beyond four walls. "My father kept this during his years on the trail," Bo said, settling into the chair beside her. "He wasn't much for formal education, but he was the wisest man I ever knew." Sierra looked up with interest as he opened to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "May I?" he asked, and when she nodded he began to read. "Met a woman today whose husband beat her near to death," Bo read aloud. "She was hiding in our camp, scared as a cornered rabbit. Cookie wanted to send her back, said it wasn't our business. But sometimes a man's got to decide what kind of person he wants to be. We gave her food, a horse, and directions to her sister's place in California. Don't know if she made it, but we gave her a chance. That's all any of us can do for each other. Give each other chances." Sierra was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the journal's worn cover. "Your father sounds like a good man." "He was. Taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by what they own, but by how they treat those who can't defend themselves." Bo paused, choosing his words carefully. "He would have liked you, even knowing what I am, especially knowing what you are." Bo's voice carried absolute conviction. A survivor, a woman with strength enough to endure hell and still have gentleness left for a frightened horse. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a rider, Doc Samuel Morrison, Jake's younger brother, and the closest thing to a physician within 50 miles. A lean man in his 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, Doc Samuel had delivered both Bo and Margaret's baby, and had been the one to close their eyes when the fever took them. "Evening, Bo, Miss Lane." Doc Samuel tipped his hat respectfully. "Heard you had some excitement with Rosie today." "Healthy filly," Bo confirmed. "Sierra here did most of the work." Doc Samuel's eyebrows rose as he studied Sierra with new interest. "Experience with horses?" Some, Sierra said quietly. My father trained them. Well, I hope you'll consider helping old Mrs. Patterson with her mare next month. That animal's been nothing but trouble for every man who's tried to handle her, but she might take to a woman's touch. It was a simple request, but Bo saw how it affected Sierra. The way her spine straightened, how her eyes brightened at the prospect of being useful, needed for her skills rather than pitied for her circumstances. I'd be honored to help, Sierra said and meant it. After Doc Samuel left, they sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the ranch. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound wild and lonesome, but somehow fitting. Bo, Sierra said suddenly, why are you being so kind to me? The question had been building for days, he realized. She'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to reveal expectations or demands that would transform his kindness into just another form of ownership. Because you deserve kindness, Bo said simply. And because helping you heal helps me heal too. Sierra turned to study his profile in the moonlight. You're nothing like what those men expected, are you? I used to be, Bo admitted. Ruthless, quick to anger. I built this place through force and intimidation, taking what I wanted and justifying it as business. He was quiet for a moment. Losing Margaret and Emma changed me, made me realize that all the wealth in the world means nothing if you don't have someone to share it with. Is that what this is? Sierra's voice carried no accusation, only curiosity. Loneliness looking for company. Bo considered the question seriously. Maybe it started that way, but it's become something else, something I don't have words for yet. Sierra nodded slowly, as if that answer satisfied something in her that more elaborate explanations couldn't have touched. Those men who brought me here, she said, they'll be back. Let them come. You don't understand. Vincent has influence, money. The railroad men have lawyers, judges in their pockets. They can make life very difficult for anyone who stands in their way. Bo's smile held no warmth. Miss Lane, I've been making life difficult for people who stand in my way since before you were born. Money and influence work both ways, and I've got plenty of both. But if it comes to violence, then I'll handle it. Bo's voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who'd faced down rustlers, claimed jumpers, and worse in his climb to wealth and power. I won't let anyone hurt you again, that's a promise. Sierra searched his face in the moonlight and found only truth there. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she allowed herself to truly believe that she might be safe. As they prepared to go inside, Sierra's hand briefly touched Bo's arm, the first voluntary physical contact she'd initiated since her arrival. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything. Bo covered her hand with his, the gesture gentle and brief. Thank you for letting me help, for giving me a reason to be the man my father raised me to be. Inside the house, they parted ways at the foot of the stairs, Sierra to her room, Bo to his study, where he would read more of his father's journal and remember what it meant to live with honor. Outside, Hope whickered softly to her mother in the stable, two voices in the darkness, finding comfort in each other's presence. It was a sound that spoke of new beginnings, of life persisting despite hardship, of the possibility that even the most broken things might find their way back to wholeness. 2 weeks after Hope's birth, Sierra appeared at breakfast wearing something Bo hadn't seen since her arrival, a small cameo brooch pinned to her collar. The piece was delicate and old-fashioned, carved with the profile of a woman in flowing robes, and despite obvious attempts to clean it, the silver setting showed tarnish and wear. It was my mother's, Sierra explained when she noticed Bo's attention. The only thing of hers I managed to keep. The brooch looked out of place against her simple work dress, like a diamond in a coal bin. But Sierra wore it with quiet pride. Bo understood the significance. She was reclaiming pieces of herself, small acts of defiance against those who'd tried to strip away her identity. She was beautiful, Bo said, noting the resemblance between the cameo's profile and Sierra's own. Delicate features. She died when I was 12. Consumption. Sierra's fingers touched the brooch unconsciously. Papa said she was the finest lady in Kansas. Even though we never had much money, she taught me to read, to carry myself with dignity. No matter what circumstances we faced, she'd be proud of the woman you've become. Sierra's smile was small, but genuine. I hope so. Some days I wonder if I've forgotten everything she tried to teach me. After breakfast, Bo found Sierra in his study, running her fingers along the spines of his books with something approaching reverence. The room contained one of the finest private libraries in Wyoming Territory, leather-bound volumes on everything from animal husbandry to Shakespeare, collected over years of prosperity. You're welcome to read anything that interests you, Bo said, noting how her eyes lingered on the poetry section. Vincent said reading was a waste of time for women, Sierra murmured, then caught herself. I'm sorry. I shouldn't speak of him. You should speak of whatever helps you heal. Bo pulled a slim volume from the shelf, Tennyson's poems, bound in green leather with gold lettering. Sometimes putting words to our experiences helps us understand them. Sierra accepted the book carefully, as if it were made of spun glass. I used to read to my father in the evenings. He wasn't much for letters himself, but he loved stories. Then you'll appreciate the library. Feel free to make yourself at home. Over the following days, Bo often found Sierra curled in the study's window seat, reading with the focused intensity of someone making up for lost time. She had beautiful handwriting, he discovered, when she began helping with the ranch's correspondence. Her letters were clear and precise, with elegant flourishes that spoke of proper education. The breakthrough came when Sierra offered to help with the account books. Bo's records, while accurate, were purely functional. Numbers in columns with minimal notation. Sierra's approach revealed a mind for organization and detail that transformed the chaos of cattle sales and supply purchases into something approaching art. You have a gift for this, Bo told her, reviewing her neat summaries of the month's transactions. Papa always said I had a head for figures. He wanted to send me to teachers' college before. She trailed off, but Bo could fill in the blanks. Before her mother died, before money became scarce, before survival took precedence over education, their growing partnership was interrupted by unexpected visitors. Thomas Hartwell arrived on a Thursday morning, hat in hand and worry etched deep in his weathered features. Bo had known Thomas for 15 years, a good man with a small spread 30 miles south, struggling to make ends meet like most of the smaller ranchers in the territory. Bo, I hate to come asking favors, Thomas began, his voice heavy with embarrassment. No favors between neighbors, Bo said firmly. What's the trouble? The story emerged in halting phrases. The railroad had called in Thomas's loan early, demanding payment in full within 30 days or face foreclosure. The terms were impossible. Thomas owed more than his entire ranch was worth, trapped by predatory lending practices that had become common as the railroad companies consolidated their power. I've got nowhere else to turn, Thomas finished. The bank won't extend the loan, and the railroad's demanding payment in gold, not cattle or land. Bo knew the game. The railroad wanted Thomas's water rights, and they were using legal manipulation to steal what they couldn't buy. It was a familiar pattern, one he'd seen played out across the territory as big money squeezed out the small ranchers who'd built their lives on honest work. How much do you owe? Bo asked. $8,000. It was a fortune to Thomas, but barely a month's income for Bo's operation. The answer was simple, but Bo found himself glancing at Sierra before responding. Her expression was intent, following the conversation with the sharp attention of someone who understood being caught in a web of powerful enemies. I'll cover the loan, Bo said simply. Thomas's face went white. Bo, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Bo's tone brooked no argument. We'll structure it as a partnership. You keep your land, I get a share of your breeding program. Fair terms, reasonable timeline. Why? Thomas's voice cracked slightly. Why would you risk $8,000 on a small-timer like me? Bo glanced again at Sierra, who was watching him with something that might have been admiration. Because some things are worth more than money, because good people deserve a chance to build something honest. After Thomas left, tears in his eyes and renewed hope in his step, Sierra found Bo on the front porch. He was staring out at his vast holdings, but his expression suggested he was seeing something beyond the immediate landscape. "That was a good thing you did," Sierra said quietly. "It was the right thing." Bo turned to face her. "My father always said that wealth without purpose is just hoarding. Thomas has a family, a dream. He deserves the chance to see it through. $8,000 is a lot of money." Bo's laugh held no bitterness. "I've spent more than that on a single bull. Money's only useful if it serves something greater than itself." They sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of gold. Sierra's fingers worried the edge of her mother's cameo, a gesture Bo had come to recognize as a sign of deep thought. "Vincent used money as a weapon," she said suddenly. "Control through dependence, kindness with conditions attached. I'd never seen wealth used to free someone before." "Money reveals character," Bo said. "It doesn't create it. Is that what you're doing with me? Using your wealth to free me?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore. Bo considered his answer carefully. "I'm using whatever I have, money, influence, protection, to give you choices. What you do with those choices is entirely up to you." Sierra turned to study his profile, seeing past the successful rancher to the man who'd lost everything that mattered and was slowly learning to care again. "Choice," she repeated, as if tasting the word. I'd forgotten what that felt like. That evening Sierra spoke her first complete sentence without prompting or direct question. They were tending to Hope, who had grown bold enough to venture outside. The stable for short explorations of the immediate yard. "Thank you," Sierra said, watching the filly gambol in the fading light. "Not just for helping me, but for showing me what kindness without conditions looks like." Bo felt something shift in his chest, not the painful ache that had characterized the past 3 years, but something warmer and more hopeful. "Thank you," he replied, "for reminding me that broken things can heal if they're handled gently enough." Under the vast Wyoming sky, two people who'd lost faith in human goodness began the delicate work of learning to trust again. Around them, the ranch continued its eternal rhythms, cattle lowing in distant pastures, horses nickering softly in their stalls, the wind carrying scents of sage and possibility across the endless prairie. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but for now, the evening was peaceful and full of promise. The discovery came by accident. Sierra was helping Mrs. Chen dust the study when a leather case fell from behind a row of books, spilling its contents across the Persian rug. Bo entered to find her kneeling among scattered military documents and medals, her face pale with something between shock and understanding. "I didn't mean to pry," Sierra said quickly, but her eyes remained fixed on the bronze star that lay gleaming against the dark carpet. Bo knelt beside her, carefully gathering the remnants of a life he'd tried to forget. The Medal of Honor caught the light as he lifted it, its ribbon faded, but the inscription still clear. "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." "Antietam," Bo said quietly, settling the medal back in its case. "September of '62. I was barely 20, thought I knew everything about courage and honor." Sierra picked up a daguerreotype that had fallen beside the medals, a young man in Union blue, his face unmarked by the lines that would come with years of hard living and harder choices. "You look so young," she said softly. "I was too young to understand what war really costs." Bo's fingers traced the edge of the photograph. "I enlisted thinking it would be grand adventure, that I'd come home covered in glory, with stories to tell my children." "What happened at Antietam?" Bo was quiet for so long that Sierra thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 20 years' remembrance. "My unit was pinned down by Confederate artillery, 37 men trapped in a shallow depression with nowhere to go but forward or into the ground." He paused, gathering courage for words he'd never spoken aloud. The artillery position was maybe 200 yards away, but it might as well have been 2 miles. Every time we tried to advance, they cut us down. The memory played behind his eyes like a film strip he couldn't stop. The screams of wounded, the men, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the terrible mathematics of war that reduced human lives to strategic calculations. I saw a gap in their firing pattern, Bo continued. A blind spot on their left flank. It would take someone running alone, no support, hoping to reach their position before they could adjust their aim. You went alone. Someone had to. Those men had families waiting for them, futures to build. I was just a ranch hand's son with nothing to lose. But he'd had everything to lose, Sierra realized. His youth, his innocence, his faith in the basic goodness of humanity. War had taken those things as surely as it had taken lives. I made it to their position, Bo said simply, disabled the artillery, held the ground until my unit could advance. 37 men lived to see another day because of it. And you earned the Medal of Honor. I earned the knowledge that killing comes easier than most people want to admit. Bo's voice held no pride, only the weary acceptance of a man who'd learned too much about his own capacity for violence. After the war, I came west thinking distance might wash away the blood on my hands. Instead, I found new reasons to fight. Sierra studied the medals with new understanding. Here was the source of Bo's quiet confidence, his absolute certainty that he could protect what mattered to him. He wasn't just a wealthy rancher. He was a warrior who'd learned to channel his deadly skills toward building rather than destroying. "Is that why you're not afraid of Vincent?" she asked. "Of what he might do? Vincent Cray is a coward who hurts defenseless women," Bo said, his voice carrying the cold certainty of professional judgment. "He's never faced someone who can fight back on equal terms." The conversation was interrupted by Jake's arrival, his expression grim as he delivered news that neither Bo nor Sierra wanted to hear. "Trouble in town, boss. That Cray fellow's been asking questions about Miss Sierra, offering money for information about where she might be staying." Sierra's hand moved instinctively to her throat, old fears rising like floodwater. "He's here, in Wyoming. Been there 3 days, Jake continued. "Staying at the Cattleman's Hotel, throwing money around like water. Got half the townspeople convinced he's her loving fiancé, worried sick about her welfare." Bo's expression went cold and still in a way that reminded Sierra powerfully of his military photograph. "What kind of questions?" "Asking about ranches. That might take in a woman of questionable reputation, making it sound like he's trying to rescue her from a life of shame." The manipulation was masterful, Sierra realized. Vincent was rewriting their history, casting himself as the concerned lover and her as the fallen woman who'd run away from respectability. By the time he was finished, any decent person would feel obligated to help reunite them. "There's more," Jake said reluctantly. "He's got papers, legal documents claiming guardianship rights, saying she's not mentally competent to make her own decisions." Sierra felt the world tilt sideways. Vincent had always been clever, but this exceeded even her worst expectations. With forged medical documents and carefully crafted lies, he could legally claim her as property, drag her back to Denver, and complete the destruction he'd started. Can he do that? Sierra's voice was barely a whisper. "In territorial court. With the right judge?" Bo's expression was grim. "Possibly. Money talks loud out here, and Vincent's got plenty to spend." The weight of inevitability settled over Sierra like a burial shroud. She'd been foolish to think she could escape, that kindness and safety were anything more than temporary illusions. Vincent would never stop hunting her, would never let her go free to build a life beyond his control. "I have to leave," Sierra said, rising to her feet with sudden determination. "Tonight, before he finds me here." "No," Bo's voice was absolute. "Running won't solve this. He'll just follow, and next time you might not find somewhere safe to land." "You don't understand," Sierra said desperately. "If he finds me here, he'll destroy you too." Your reputation, your business, everything you've built. I won't let that happen." Bo stood slowly, his movements carrying the controlled precision of a man preparing for war. "Sierra, look at me." When she met his eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch, not just determination, but something deeper and more dangerous. "I've spent 3 years hiding from life, letting grief turn me into a ghost," Bo said quietly. "You've reminded me what it means to live, to care about something beyond my own pain. I won't let Vincent Cray take that away. But the cost. Let me worry about the cost." Bo's smile held no warmth, only the cold certainty of a man who'd calculated odds and found them acceptable. "Vincent thinks he's dealing with a simple rancher. He's about to learn otherwise." Sierra searched his face and found only truth there, and something else that made her heart race with emotions she'd thought lost forever. "Why?" she whispered. "Why risk everything for me?" Bo's answer was simple, direct, and completely honest. "Because somewhere along the way, protecting you stopped being charity and became something I can't live without." The admission hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible gap. Sierra felt tears sting her eyes. Not of fear this time, but of something that might eventually become hope. Outside, the wind was rising, bringing with it the scent of rain and the promise of storms to come. But inside Bo's study, surrounded by the artifacts of a warrior's past and the medals of a man who'd learned to fight for what mattered, Sierra finally allowed herself to believe that not all battles were destined to be lost. "What do we do?" she asked. Bo's smile was sharp as a cavalry saber. "We fight back." The music box was a thing of simple beauty, carved from a single piece of pine and polished to a warm, honey glow. Bo had worked on it in secret during the quiet hours before dawn, his calloused hands shaping the delicate mechanism that would play the melody Sierra hummed when she thought no one was listening. He found her in the garden Mrs. Chen had coaxed from the harsh Wyoming soil, kneeling among the early vegetables with dirt under her fingernails and satisfaction written across her features. The sight of her there, rooted, present, engaged with the simple act of nurturing life, made his chest tighten with emotions he was still learning to name. "I made something for you," Bo said, settling beside her among the potato plants. Sierra's eyes widened as he placed the music box in her hands. The lid was inlaid with a small mother-of-pearl star, and when she wound the tiny key, the first notes of "Amazing Grace" floated into the morning air, the same melody she'd been humming, though she'd had no idea he'd noticed. "Bo, it's beautiful," Sierra whispered, her fingers tracing the carved edges with reverent care. "You made this?" "Seemed like you should have music again," he said, suddenly uncertain. "I know it's not the same as your voice, but it's perfect." Sierra's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "No one's ever made anything for me before, just for me, with no expectations attached." The music continued its sweet progression, filling the space between them with something that felt like hope, made audible. Sierra closed her eyes, letting the melody wash over her, and for the first time since arriving at the ranch, she began to sing along. Her voice was rusty, cracked in places where Vincent's violence had left its mark, but it carried a beauty that made Bo's breath catch. Not the polished perfection of her professional days, but something raw and more honest, a voice seasoned by pain and strengthened by survival. "I thought it was gone forever," Sierra said when the song ended. "My voice, the part of me that made me, me. It was never gone," Bo said gently, just waiting for the right moment to come home. They sat in comfortable silence, the music box between them like a bridge spanning the gap between their separate sorrows. Around them, the garden bloomed with the promise of summer, tomatoes climbing their stakes, beans twining toward the sun, life persisting with stubborn grace despite the harshness of the climate. "Vincent would hate this," Sierra said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of defiant satisfaction. "He always said gardening was beneath a lady, that I should spend my time on refined pursuits." "Vincent's opinion no longer matters," Bo said, firmly, What matters is what makes you happy. Sierra began visiting the schoolhouse after that, offering to help the overwhelmed teacher with children who struggled with their letters. Word spread quickly through the small community. The mysterious woman from the Remington Ranch had a gift for reaching difficult students, a patience that seemed infinite when it came to young minds eager to learn. She's got young Tommy Peterson, reading at grade level, Sarah Mitchell told her husband over dinner. That boy's been fighting his letters since he started school 3 years ago. The praise felt foreign to Sierra, who'd spent so long believing herself worthless. That competence came as a surprise. But the children responded to her gentle encouragement, and their progress filled something in her that had been empty since Vincent's attack. Bo found her one afternoon helping 8-year-old Mary Hartwell, Thomas's youngest daughter, sound out words from a primer. The little girl's face was scrunched with concentration, her finger tracing each letter as Sierra guided her through the pronunciation. B-R-A-V-E, Mary read slowly. Brave. Exactly right, Sierra said, her smile radiant with genuine pleasure. You're becoming quite the reader, Miss Mary. Watching her teach, Bo saw the woman Sierra had been meant to become before violence derailed her path. Not just the singer, but the teacher, the nurturer, the person who found joy in helping others discover their own potential. That evening, as they shared dinner on the front porch, Sierra spoke of dreams she'd thought lost forever. I wanted to teach, she said, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. Before the singing took off, before Vincent, I thought I might open a school for children whose parents couldn't afford proper education. You still could, Bo said. Wyoming Territory needs good teachers, needs people who understand that education is about more than just memorizing facts. With my reputation, my history. Sierra's laugh held no bitterness, only the weary acceptance of someone who'd learned to see herself through society's harsh lens. Your history is surviving. Your reputation should be helping children learn to read. Bo's voice carried absolute conviction. Anyone who can't see that isn't worth worrying about. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Jake rode up with news that made Bo's expression harden and Sierra's blood run cold. Sheriff Williams is in town, Jake reported. Come all the way from Cheyenne with papers. For Miss Sierra. That Crave fellow's got himself a court order. Sierra felt the earth shift beneath her. What kind of court order? Competency hearing, Jake said grimly. Claims you're not mentally sound, need to be returned to his care for your own protection. The legal trap was closing with mechanical precision. Vincent had found a corrupt judge, presented falsified medical evidence, and constructed a narrative that painted Sierra as a mentally unstable woman who'd fled the protection of her loving guardian. In territorial court, where women had few rights and fewer advocates, such orders were often rubber-stamped without meaningful examination. When? Bo asked, his voice deadly quiet. Tomorrow morning. Sheriff's serving the papers tonight, expecting you to appear at the courthouse by 10. Sierra stood slowly, her hands shaking, but her voice steady. I won't go back to him. I'd rather die than go back. You won't have to, Bo said, rising to face her. We'll fight this legally, publicly. Expose Vincent for what he really is. With what proof? His word against mine? Sierra's voice cracked slightly. He's got money, influence, forged documents that make him look like a concerned guardian. I'm just a broken woman with a history of what people assume I am. You're not broken, Bo said fiercely, and you're not alone. But even as he spoke the words, they both knew the odds. Territorial justice was rough and often arbitrary, particularly when it came to women's rights. Vincent had money enough to buy favorable rulings, and his story, the concerned fiancé trying to rescue his mentally unstable beloved, would play well to judges who saw women as property to be managed rather than people with agency. There is another way, Bo said slowly, an idea forming that was either brilliant or completely insane. What way? Bo's smile was sharp as a blade. We get married tonight. before the sheriff can serve those papers." Sierra stared at him, speechless. Marriage would change everything: her legal status, her protection under law, her ability to make decisions about her own fate. A husband's rights superseded those of a guardian, and Beau's reputation and wealth would carry weight that her word alone never could. "Beau, you can't. The scandal, the gossip, what people would say about you marrying someone like me. Let them talk," Beau said simply. "I've never cared much for other people's opinions anyway, but marriage it's permanent. You'd be tied to me forever, regardless of what happens." Beau stepped closer, his hands gentle as they framed her face. "Sierra, I've been dead inside for 3 years. You brought me back to life. If you'll have me, there's nowhere else I'd rather be tied." The proposal hung between them, born of desperation, but rooted in something deeper and truer than either had expected to find. Sierra searched his eyes and found only sincerity. No calculation, no obligation, just the steady strength of a man who'd made his choice and would stand by it regardless of consequences. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Sierra's answer came not in words, but in the way she rose on her toes to kiss him, soft and sweet and full of promises neither had dared make before. When they broke apart, both were breathless with the magnitude of what they'd decided. "We'll need a preacher," Sierra said practically. "Reverend Mills owes me a favor," Beau replied, "and he's never been one to ask too many questions about urgent ceremonies." As they prepared to change their lives forever, the music box sat forgotten on the porch railing, its melody carrying across the evening air like a benediction. Tomorrow would bring Vincent Cray and his legal machinations, but tonight belonged to two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances. The first notes of their new life together were already playing, sweet and strong and full of hope. The wedding ceremony took place in Reverend Mills' parlor at midnight, witnessed by Mrs. Mills and Jake Morrison under the flickering light of oil lamps. Sierra wore her mother's cameo and a simple blue dress that Mrs. Chen had altered to fit, while Beau stood beside her in his best suit, his father's pocket watch gleaming against his vest. "Do you, Sierra Lane, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" "I do," Sierra said, her voice clear and strong, carrying none of the tremor that had marked her speech just weeks before. When Beau slipped his mother's wedding ring onto her finger, a simple gold band he'd retrieved from his family's jewelry box, Sierra felt something settle into place that had nothing to do with legal protection. This was real, this moment of choosing each other despite the circumstances that had brought them together. They were husband and wife by 1 o'clock the morning, the certificate signed and witnessed, their union legally binding under territorial law. Beau kissed his bride gently, a promise of tenderness that spoke of patience and genuine affection rather than mere convenience. "Whatever comes next," Beau whispered against her forehead, "we face it together." But what came next was far worse than either of them had imagined. Sheriff Williams arrived at dawn with more than just court papers. Accompanying him were 3 well-dressed men who introduced themselves as territorial judges, a federal marshal from Cheyenne, and most shocking of all, Cornelius Whitmore, not as an observer, but as Vincent Cray's legal representative. "I'm afraid there's been a development," Sheriff Williams announced, his weathered face uncomfortable with the task at hand. "These gentlemen have new information regarding Miss Lane's legal status." "Mrs. Remington," Beau corrected firmly. "My wife and I were married last night in a ceremony performed by Reverend Mills." Vincent Cray stepped forward then, and Sierra felt her blood turn to ice. He looked exactly as she remembered, handsome in a cold, calculated way, with pale blue eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. His expensive suit and confident bearing spoke of wealth and power, but Sierra could see the cruelty that lurked beneath his civilized facade. "How convenient," Vincent said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Denver society. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that marriage is invalid. He produced a leather portfolio with the flourish of a magician revealing his greatest trick. From it, he withdrew a document that made Sierra's knees buckle and Beau's face go white with rage. A marriage certificate, Vincent announced, issued in Denver, Colorado territory on November 15, 1881, between myself and Miss Sierra Lane. The paper looked genuine. Official stamps, proper signatures, witnessed and notarized with all the legal requirements. But Sierra knew it was impossible because she'd never married Vincent Cray. The November date coincided with her escape attempt when she'd been hiding in a boarding house, planning her flight to Kansas. "That's a forgery," Sierra said, her voice shaking with anger, rather than fear. "I never married him. I never even agreed to marry him." "My dear," Vincent's tone was patronizingly gentle, the voice of a concerned husband dealing with a wife's hysteria. "I understand that your condition has affected your memory, but the documentation is quite clear. Judge Harrington, a thin man with cold eyes and an expensive suit, stepped forward to examine the certificate. Everything appears to be in order. Miss Lane, I beg your pardon, Mrs. Cray, is legally married to Mr. Cray. Any subsequent ceremony would be bigamous and therefore invalid." "You're lying," Beau said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man barely restraining himself. "From violence, both of you are lying. Now see here," Judge Harrington blustered, "I'll not have my integrity questioned by a territorial rancher, regardless of his wealth." "Your integrity?" Beau's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "A judge who travels hundreds of miles to oversee a simple competency hearing? Who arrives with railroad money in his pocket and predetermined conclusions in his briefcase?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Whitmore's face flushed red, but Vincent remained cool and collected, clearly having anticipated this line of attack. "I understand your confusion, Mr. Remington," Vincent said smoothly. "But you must see that my wife's mental state has deteriorated significantly since her episode. The trauma of our separation has clearly affected her ability to distinguish reality from fantasy." "What trauma?" Sierra found her voice, anger, burning away the last of her fear. "You mean when you beat me senseless? When you destroyed my voice and left me for dead?" "My dear, you fell down a flight of stairs," Vincent replied with sickening patience. "A tragic accident that occurred during one of your episodes. The doctors in Denver can provide extensive documentation of your declining mental state." The trap was masterful in its completeness. Vincent had constructed an alternate reality supported by forged documents, bought witnesses, and corrupted officials. In his version of events, Sierra was his legal wife suffering from mental illness, and her claims of abuse were delusions brought on by trauma and instability. "I have additional documentation," Vincent continued, producing more papers from his portfolio. "Medical reports detailing Mrs. Cray's condition, sworn statements from witnesses to her erratic behavior, and most importantly, a court order from Denver awarding me full guardianship rights due to her mental incapacity." Federal Marshal Davidson, a large man with graying hair and tired eyes, stepped forward reluctantly. "I'm sorry, folks, but the law is clear. If Mrs. Cray is indeed legally married to Mr. Cray, then any subsequent marriage is invalid. And if she's been declared mentally incompetent by a Colorado court, then Mr. Cray has the legal right to determine her medical care and residence." Sierra felt the walls closing in around her. The legal system that should have protected her had been corrupted into a weapon, wielded by a man with enough money and influence to buy any outcome he desired. "This is about more than Sierra," Beau said suddenly, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "This whole thing, the gift to my ranch, the carefully timed arrival of officials, the railroad connection. This isn't about recovering a mentally ill wife. This is about my land." Vincent's smile was thin and cold. "My, you are perceptive, Mr. Remington. The railroad wants my water rights," Beau continued, understanding flooding through him. "But they can't force me to sell And they can't undercut my prices enough to bankrupt me. So they needed another angle. Scandal, Whitmore said, no longer bothering to hide his involvement. A prominent rancher involved in bigamy, harboring another man's mentally ill wife, accused of taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. Such a man might find his business relationships strained. The true scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Sierra hadn't been delivered to Beau's ranch as crude entertainment. She'd been bait in an elaborate trap designed to destroy his reputation and force the sale of his property. Her suffering was just collateral damage in a scheme motivated by greed and executed with ruthless precision. Banks don't like to do business with men of questionable character, Judge Harrington added. Suppliers become reluctant to extend credit. Business partners start to question their associations. And if social pressure doesn't work, Vincent concluded, there's always the legal route. A man who knowingly marries another man's wife, who refuses to return stolen property, such behavior suggests criminal intent. Sierra felt rage building in her chest like a prairie fire, not just for herself, but for Beau, for Thomas Hartwell, and all the other small ranchers who stood in the railroad's path. These men would destroy anyone who opposed their vision of progress, crushing lives with the same casual indifference they showed toward clearing timber. There's just one problem with your plan, Sierra said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone present, including herself. Vincent raised an eyebrow. Oh? Sierra reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a small leather journal, one she'd been carrying since her arrival at the ranch. I've been documenting everything. Every conversation, every threat, every detail of how I really ended up in that wagon. She opened the journal, revealing pages of careful handwriting detailing dates, names, and conversations, including the discussion between you and Whitmore about using me as bait to trap Beau. I was conscious in that wagon longer than you thought. For the first time, Vincent's composure cracked slightly. The ravings of a mentally ill woman have no legal standing. Maybe not, Sierra agreed, but they might be very interesting to the territorial governor and to the newspapers in Denver and Cheyenne. People love a good story about corrupt railroad barons and their criminal associates. The threat was real, and Vincent knew it. Even if her testimony couldn't convict him in court, the scandal would destroy his reputation and possibly his business relationships. Railroad money bought many things, but it couldn't completely silence the press or prevent public outrage. You're making a mistake, Mr. Remington, Vincent said, his mask of civility finally slipping. I'm offering you a simple solution. Return my property and walk away clean. Refuse, and I'll destroy everything you've built. Beau's smile was sharp. As a cavalry saber, I've been destroyed before, Mr. Cray. I rebuilt from nothing once. I can do it again if necessary. The question is whether you're prepared for the kind of war you're starting. The standoff stretched taut as a wire, two forces of will testing each other's resolve. Around them, the officials who'd seemed so confident minutes before now looked uncertain, aware that they'd been caught in something larger and more dangerous than a simple competency hearing. This isn't over, Vincent said finally, his voice carrying promises of future violence. No, Beau agreed. It's not, but when it is, only one of us will be left standing. As the corrupt officials prepared to leave, Sierra felt something shift inside her, not fear or resignation, but cold determination. Vincent had made one crucial error in his elaborate plan. He'd underestimated her ability to fight back. The war for her freedom was just beginning, but for the first time since that terrible night in Denver, Sierra believed she might actually win. Beau retrieved his father's Colt revolver from its place of honor above the study mantel that evening, the weight of the weapon familiar and deadly in his hands. He'd hoped never to use it again, but some situations demanded the language of violence that words could not speak. You don't have to do this, Sierra said, watching him check the cylinder with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd killed before. And might need to do so again. Yes, I do. Beau's voice was quiet, final. Vincent made his choice when he decided to threaten you. Now I'm making mine. The gun was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. Ivory grips worn smooth by generations of Remington hands, the steel barrel etched with intricate scrollwork that caught the lamplight. Beau's father had carried it through Indian wars and cattle drives, had passed it down with the admonition that it should only be drawn when words had failed and justice demanded action. There has to be another way, Sierra pressed. Legal channels, appeals to higher authorities. Higher authorities? Beau's laugh held no humor. Sierra, we just watched a federal marshal stand by while corrupt judges validated forged documents. The law isn't broken out here. It's been bought. Sierra knew he was right, but the thought of Beau risking everything in a gunfight with Vincent filled her with terror. She'd seen what violence could do, how quickly it could destroy the good along with the bad. What if you lose? She whispered. Beau looked up from cleaning the revolver, his eyes holding the steady calm of a man who'd made peace with mortality. Then at least you'll know someone thought you were worth fighting for. The next morning brought Thomas Hartwell and 6 other ranchers to Beau's doorstep, men whose spreads dotted the territory, whose livelihoods depended on the railroad's willingness to transport their cattle at fair rates. They'd heard about Vincent's accusations, about the conspiracy to seize Beau's land, and they understood that none of them were safe if the railroad could destroy the wealthiest rancher in the territory. We stand with you, Beau, Thomas said simply. Whatever comes next, you don't face it alone. The solidarity was touching, but Beau knew that armed ranchers would only give Vincent's supporters ammunition for their claims of lawlessness. The fight ahead required strategy, not just courage. I appreciate the support, Beau said, but this needs to be handled clean. One man against another, no complications. Vincent won't fight fair, warned Samuel Patterson, whose own ranch bordered railroad land. Men like him don't believe in honor. Then I'll have to believe in it enough for both of us. Sierra spent the afternoon with Reverend Mills, seeking counsel from a man who'd ministered to frontier communities for 30 years and understood the complexities of justice in a land where law often lagged behind necessity. Violence begets. Violence, the Reverend said gently. But sometimes a man must stand between evil and innocence, regardless of personal cost. I'm afraid, Sierra admitted. Not just for Beau, but for what this might make him become. He's found peace here, found a way to live with his past. If he kills for me, child, Reverend Mills' voice was kind but firm, he's not killing for you. He's killing to protect what's right. There's a difference that matters in the eyes of God and man. That evening, Sheriff Williams arrived with news that changed everything. His face was grim as he delivered a message that would force the confrontation everyone had been dreading. Vincent Cray has challenged you to a formal duel, Williams announced. Sunrise tomorrow, Main Street. He's claiming satisfaction for the theft of his wife and the damage to his honor. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged gun. Dueling had been outlawed in most territories, but in practice it still occurred when men's honor demanded satisfaction that courts couldn't provide. And if I refuse? Beau asked, though they all knew the answer. He'll claim cowardice. Say you're hiding behind legal technicalities because you know you're guilty. Williams shook his head. He's been spreading that story all afternoon. By morning, half the territory will believe you're a thief and a coward. Clever, Beau admitted grimly. Force me to fight or destroy my reputation either way. Sierra felt the trap closing with mechanical precision. Vincent had maneuvered Beau into an impossible position. Fight and risk death, or refuse and face social destruction that would accomplish the railroad's goals just as effectively. There's more, Williams continued reluctantly. Words come down, and from the territorial capital. If you go through with this duel, win or lose, there'll be federal charges. The governor's under pressure to show that Wyoming territory can maintain law and order. The final piece of Vincent's strategy became clear. Even if Beau won the gunfight, he'd face federal prosecution for dueling. His ranch would be seized, his assets frozen, and Sierra would be left defenseless against Vincent's legal machinations. It was checkmate disguised as a choice. "He's thought of everything," Sierra said, her voice hollow with despair. "Not everything," Bo replied, a dangerous light entering his eyes. "He's made one crucial mistake." "What mistake?" He assumed I'd play by his rules. Bo spent the remaining hours of daylight making arrangements that surprised everyone who thought they knew him. Instead of preparing for a gunfight, he was writing letters to newspapers in Denver and Cheyenne, to the territorial governor, to business associates throughout the West. "What are you doing?" Sierra asked, finding him at his desk as midnight approached. "Telling the truth," Bo said simply. "All of it. Vincent's abuse, the railroad conspiracy, the forged documents, the corrupt officials. Everything you documented in your journal, plus everything I've observed. But the scandal will destroy Vincent Cray, not us." Bo's smile was sharp as winter steel. "See, Vincent's been operating under the assumption that I care more about my reputation than I do about justice. He's wrong. The letters detailed everything. Sierra's abuse and escape, the elaborate trap designed to steal Bo's land, the corruption of territorial officials, the railroad's systematic destruction of smaller ranches. Most importantly, they included excerpts from Sierra's journal, providing first-hand testimony of the conspiracy. These go out on the morning stage," Bo explained. "By the time Vincent realizes what's happening, every newspaper from here to San Francisco will have the story. And the duel? I'll still face him. But not for my honor. For yours." Bo's voice carried absolute conviction. "You deserve to have the truth heard, to have your voice restored, not just physically, but legally and socially." Sierra felt tears sting her eyes as she understood the scope of Bo's sacrifice. He was risking everything. His life, his wealth, his freedom, not to protect his reputation, but to ensure that her story was heard and believed. "Vincent will still have his corrupt judges," she said. "Corrupt judges can't function in the light of public scrutiny. Once the newspapers start asking questions, once territorial officials have to answer for their involvement, the whole conspiracy falls apart." It was brilliant and dangerous in equal measure. Bo was betting that public outrage would outweigh railroad money. That truth would triumph over corruption if given a fair hearing. It was the kind of gamble that could save them both or destroy them completely. And if the newspapers don't listen, if the railroad's influence extends that far— Bo's hand found hers across the desk, his touch warm and steady. "Then, at least, we tried. At least we fought back instead of running." The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, marking the beginning of what might be their last day together. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain that would either wash the land clean or turn the earth to mud. "I have something for you," Sierra said suddenly, reaching into her dress pocket. She withdrew a small object wrapped in silk, the derringer that Mrs. Chen had pressed into her hands weeks ago, along with ammunition and instructions on its use. "Just in case," Sierra said quietly. "If something happens to you, if Vincent tries to take me—" Bo accepted the tiny weapon with the gravity it deserved. It was small enough to hide, deadly enough to change the outcome of any confrontation, and represented Sierra's transformation from victim to survivor. "I hope you never have to use it," Bo said. "So do I. But if I do, I want you to know that I won't go back to being his victim. Never again." They held each other then, in the quiet darkness of Bo's study, surrounded by books and memories and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Whatever tomorrow brought, victory or defeat, freedom or destruction, they would face it as they'd learned to face everything else. Together. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of a reckoning that had been too long delayed. In a few hours, Vincent Cray would discover that his carefully laid plans had a fatal flaw. He'd underestimated the power of two broken people who'd found something worth fighting for in each other. The final confrontation was coming, and Sierra Lane Remington was no longer afraid. Dawn came to Wyoming territory, painted in shades of blood and gold, the sunrise reflecting off storm clouds that promised either cleansing rain or destructive floods. The main street of Clearwater stretched empty and silent, its usual morning bustle replaced by the tense anticipation of violence. Bo stood at one end of the dusty thoroughfare, his father's Colt heavy at his hip, wearing the same black suit he'd worn to Margaret and Emma's funeral. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Today might mark another kind of death, the final burial of the man he'd been before Sierra arrived to resurrect his capacity for love. At the opposite end of the street, Vincent Cray waited with the confident bearing of a man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. He wore an expensive grey suit that spoke of Denver tailors and East Coast fashion, his pale hair gleaming in the morning light. The pistol at his side was ornate, silver-plated with ivory grips, a gentleman's weapon that had probably never been fired in anger. Between them the town held its breath. Sierra stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, her voice rising clear and strong above the morning silence. She'd refused to hide, refused to let Vincent's final act of violence proceed without bearing witness to its cause. "People of Clearwater," she called, her words carrying across the empty street with the power of truth finally unleashed. "You've been told lies about who I am, about why I'm here. Let me tell you the real story." Her voice had never been stronger, not even in her days as the Denver Nightingale. Pain had seasoned it, hardship had deepened it, and love had given it purpose. As she spoke, townspeople emerged from buildings and alleyways, drawn by the rare sound of absolute honesty in a world built on necessary deceptions. "Vincent Cray calls me his wife, but I never married him. He calls me mentally ill, but my only madness was believing his lies. He says he's here to rescue me, but he's the one I need rescuing from." Vincent's face darkened at her words, but he couldn't respond without breaking the formal protocols of the duel. He demanded satisfaction. For his damaged honor, to speak now would be to admit that his honor was false currency, worthless in any honest accounting. "This man," Sierra continued, pointing directly at Vincent, "beat me unconscious when I tried to leave him. He destroyed my voice out of spite and greed. He sold me to railroad men like livestock, all to steal land from honest people who've built their lives here through hard work and integrity." Mrs. Patterson gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat. Thomas Hartwell's face went white with rage as he understood the full scope of the conspiracy that had nearly cost him his ranch. Murmurs rippled through the growing crowd as Sierra's words painted a picture that made terrible sense of recent events. Sheriff Williams checked his pocket watch and stepped into the street. "Gentlemen, it's time." The formal words carried weight that transcended their simple meaning. This was more than a gunfight. It was a reckoning for Sierra's suffering, for the railroad's corruption, for every small rancher who'd been crushed by forces too large and ruthless to fight through conventional means. Bo and Vincent began walking toward each other with measured steps, each man's gait revealing his character. Bo moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd faced death before and made peace with its possibility. Vincent's stride carried arrogance, the swagger of a man who'd never encountered an opponent he couldn't buy or break. 20 paces. Sheriff Williams called. Sierra's voice continued to ring across the morning air, telling the story that Vincent's money and influence had tried to silence. "Bo Remington saved my life. Not through violence, but through kindness. He offered protection without conditions, healing without price. He married me not for gain, but to keep me safe from the man who tried to destroy me." 15 paces. The crowd was growing as word spread through the town. Doc Samuel stood beside his brother Jake, both men's faces grim with understanding. Reverend Mills clutched his Bible, lips moving in silent prayer for a just outcome to an unjust situation. 10 paces. Vincent's confident expression began to crack as he realized that Sierra's testimony was destroying his carefully constructed narrative. The townspeople weren't seeing a concerned husband trying to reclaim his mentally ill wife. They were seeing a predator facing the consequences of his cruelty. 5 paces. Beau's hand rested calmly at his side, his breathing steady and controlled. Years of military training had taught him that survival depended on clarity of mind, not speed of draw. Beside him, Vincent's breathing was rapid and shallow. The first signs of fear breaking through his cultivated composure. Turn and fire at will. Both men spun simultaneously, hands dropping to their weapons with practiced speed. But as their guns cleared leather, something happened that no one had anticipated. Sierra's voice rose in song, not words of testimony this time, but pure melody, amazing grace, carrying across the morning air with such haunting beauty that both men hesitated, fingers poised on triggers, but unable to complete the violent act while such sweetness filled the world. In that moment of suspended violence, Vincent Cray made his fatal error. Instead of firing at Beau, he turned his weapon towards Sierra, his face twisted with rage at her defiance. "If I can't have you," he snarled, "no one can." The movement broke the spell that had held the morning suspended. Beau's Colt roared like thunder, the bullet taking Vincent center mass before he could complete his murderous turn. Vincent's shot went wild, his ornate pistol spinning from nerveless fingers as he crumpled to the dusty street. Sierra's song never faltered, even as Vincent fell. Her voice soared over the sound of dying echoes, transforming a moment of violence into something approaching redemption. The man who'd tried to silence her forever had been stopped by the very voice he'd sought to destroy. Vincent Cray lay motionless in the Wyoming dust, his expensive suit staining red, his pale eyes staring sightlessly at the storm clouds gathering overhead. The conspiracy he'd helped orchestrate was finished, ended by his own inability to resist one final act of cruelty. Beau holstered his smoking revolver and walked toward his wife, his face showing not triumph but relief that the nightmare was finally over. Sierra's song began to fade as he approached, but her voice remained strong and clear, no longer broken, no longer silenced. Finally free to speak her truth to a world that had learned to listen. The silence that followed the gunshot was broken not by screams or chaos, but by the sound of witnesses stepping forward. Thomas Hartwell was the first to speak, his voice carrying the authority of a man whose word had weight in territorial courts. "I saw Vincent Cray turn his weapon toward Mrs. Remington," Thomas declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. Beau fired in defense of his wife's life. "I saw it too," called Doc Samuel, his medical training lending credibility to his testimony. "Clear case of justified defense." One by one, the townspeople who'd gathered to witness the duel added their voices to the chorus of truth. Mrs. Patterson, Reverend Mills, even Sheriff Williams himself, all confirmed that Vincent had broken the rules of honorable combat by targeting an unarmed woman. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Judge Harrington, the corrupt official who'd arrived with Vincent's forged documents, stepped forward with his face pale and his hands shaking. "I need to make a confession," he announced, his voice carrying across the street. "The documents I validated yesterday were forgeries. I was paid to overlook irregularities in Mr. Cray's paperwork." The admission sent shockwaves through the crowd. A territorial judge confessing to corruption was unprecedented, but Sierra's public testimony and Vincent's death had apparently shattered whatever hold the railroad money had maintained over him. "How much?" Sheriff Williams asked grimly. $5,000, Harrington said, shame coloring his voice. "Deposited in a Denver bank account in my wife's name, and the marriage certificate. False, created by a forger in Vincent Cray's employ, using official stamps stolen from the Colorado Territorial Courthouse." Harrington pulled the document from his coat and tore it in half. "Mrs. Remington was never legally married to that man. Cornelius Whitmore chose that moment to attempt escape, backing toward his horse with the desperate movements of a man who'd watched his carefully planned conspiracy collapse in the space of minutes. But Jake Morrison and Thomas Hartwell blocked his path, their faces grim with the satisfaction of catching a predator in the act. "Going somewhere, Whitmore?" Jake asked mildly. "This is a misunderstanding," Whitmore blustered. "I was merely representing a client's interests. You were part of a conspiracy to defraud honest ranchers of their land," Thomas corrected. "I've got written proof of the railroad's involvement thanks to Mrs. Remington's documentation." Sierra stepped down from the boardwalk, walking past Vincent's body without a glance. Her focus was entirely on the men who'd tried to use her suffering as a weapon against innocent people. "Tell them about the other ranchers," Sierra said, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Tell them about the families you've destroyed with your loan schemes and forged documents." Federal Marshal Davidson, who'd stood silent throughout the confrontation, finally found his voice. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm placing you under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Your cooperation in exposing the full scope of this operation might influence your sentencing." The marshal's intervention wasn't driven by Sutton virtue. Bo's letters to newspapers and government officials had reached their destinations on the morning stage, carried by riders who'd left before dawn. By now, editors in Denver and Cheyenne were reading detailed accounts of railroad corruption, and territorial officials were facing uncomfortable questions about their oversight of local courts. "The governor's office sent a telegram this morning," Davidson continued. "There's to be a full investigation of land acquisition practices in Wyoming Territory. Any officials found to be compromised will face federal charges." Judge Harrington's confession had opened floodgates that couldn't be closed. Other officials began stepping forward, admitting to bribes and fraudulent rulings, each seeking lenient treatment in exchange for testimony against their railroad benefactors. Sierra found herself at the center of a transformation that went far beyond her personal vindication. Her courage in documenting and exposing the conspiracy had sparked a territorial-wide reckoning with corruption that had festered for years. "Mrs. Remington," Marshal Davidson said formally, "would you be willing to testify before a territorial grand jury regarding your experiences with Mr. Cray and his associates?" "Yes," Sierra replied without hesitation. "It's time the truth was heard completely." Bo approached his wife then, holstering his father's Colt with the satisfied finality of a man who'd used violence for its intended purpose, the protection of innocence. He took Sierra's hands in his, noting how steady they were, how she'd faced the culmination of her nightmare without flinching. "It's over," he said simply. "No," Sierra corrected, her smile radiant with possibilities he was only beginning to understand. "It's just beginning." Around them, the people of Clearwater began the work of rebuilding trust in institutions that had betrayed them. Honest officials would replace corrupt ones, fair laws would supersede purchased verdicts, and the railroad would be forced to conduct business through negotiation rather than manipulation. The storm clouds that had gathered through the morning finally opened, sending life-giving rain across the thirsty land. Vincent Cray's blood mixed with Wyoming earth, returning to the soil that had nurtured better men than he could ever have been. But Sierra and Bo stood together in the rain, their faces turned toward a sky that was already beginning to clear, revealing blue horizons that stretched endlessly toward a future they would build together. Not through violence or manipulation, but through love, honesty, and the simple courage to stand for what was right. The reckoning was complete, and justice had finally found its voice. 6 months later, the Wyoming Territory Courthouse in Cheyenne rang with Sierra's voice as she concluded her testimony before the territorial grand jury. Her words had helped indict 12 railroad officials, 4 territorial judges, and 6 land speculators in what newspapers were calling the largest corruption scandal in Western history. "Thank you, Mrs. Remington," the prosecutor said as Sierra stepped down from the witness stand. Your courage in documenting these crimes has been instrumental in bringing justice to Wyoming territory." Bo waited for her in the courthouse corridor, wearing his best suit and the satisfied expression of a man who'd seen justice served. The legal proceedings had taken months, but every day had brought new revelations of the railroad's systematic corruption. Thomas Hartwell and dozens of other small ranchers had recovered their stolen lands, while honest officials replaced the corrupt ones who'd sold their integrity for railroad gold. "How does it feel?" Bo asked as they walked into the autumn sunshine. "To know that your voice helped change an entire territory." Sierra considered the question seriously, her fingers unconsciously touching the new cameo brooch Bo had commissioned, carved with her own profile instead of her mother's, symbolizing the woman she'd become rather than the one she'd been born to be. "It feels like I finally understand what Papa meant when he said some things are worth fighting for," she replied. "I just never imagined my fight would help so many other people." They rode home to the ranch in comfortable silence, watching the landscape roll past with the satisfied contentment of people who'd earned their peace through struggle. The autumn colors painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, a vast canvas that spoke of seasons turning and life continuing its eternal rhythms. The Remington Ranch had prospered in the months since Vincent's death, with railroad corruption exposed and honest transportation rates restored. Bo's cattle business had expanded beyond his wildest expectations. But more importantly, the ranch had become a home again, filled with laughter, music, and the daily joys of two people learning to build a life together. Sierra had opened her school in the spring, a small building on the ranch's east pasture, where children from across the territory came to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. Her approach to education was revolutionary for its time. She believed that every child, regardless of background or natural ability, deserved the chance to discover their potential. "Miss Sierra," little Mary Hartwell had said just the week before, "you make words feel like music." The comment had brought tears to Sierra's eyes, reminding her that healing others had become the greatest source of her own recovery. As they crested the hill that overlooked their home, Bo and Sierra could see the changes that love had wrought. The main house had been expanded with a wing for Sierra's music room, where she spent evenings composing songs that captured the beauty and hardship of frontier life. Her voice, stronger now than it had ever been before Vincent's attack, had become the soundtrack of their happiness. In the stable, Hope had grown into a magnificent mare, her coat gleaming with health and her spirit unbroken by any harsh treatment. She'd become Sierra's personal mount, the two of them sharing an understanding that went beyond words. Both survivors who'd learned to trust again. "There's something I want to show you," Bo said as they dismounted near the house. He led Sierra to a spot on the small hill behind their home, where two simple headstones marked Margaret and Emma's graves. But now a third marker stood beside them, not a grave, but a memorial bench carved from Wyoming granite. "For Vincent?" Sierra asked, confused. "For the woman you were before him," Bo explained gently. "The Denver Nightingale who died the night. He attacked you. I thought she deserved to be remembered, even if the woman who replaced her is infinitely stronger." Sierra traced the inscription with trembling fingers. "In memory of innocence lost but not wasted, and the courage to begin again." "You don't have to forgive him," Bo continued, "but maybe you can forgive yourself for trusting him, for believing that love was supposed to be gentle." Sierra wept then, not tears of pain, but of release. She'd been carrying guilt for her own victimization, blaming herself for the trust that Vincent had exploited. Bo's memorial gave her permission to honor the woman she'd been while celebrating the one she'd become. "I want to have a baby," Sierra said suddenly, surprising them both with the declaration. Bo's face lit up with wonder. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure that I want to create life instead of just surviving it. I want to bring children into a world where their voices will be heard, where their choices will be respected." Sierra's hand found his. I want to build a family with you, Bo Remington, not because we're lonely or broken, but because we're whole. That evening, they sat on their front porch as the sun painted the sky in familiar shades of gold and rose. Sierra's music box played its gentle melody, while Hope and her new foal grazed peacefully in the nearby pasture. The scene was pastoral, and perfect but earned through struggle rather than granted by chance. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if those railroad men had chosen someone else? Sierra asked. If they'd never brought me here? Bo considered the question seriously, his arm tightening around his wife's shoulders. I try not to think about it, he admitted, because it makes me grateful for their cruelty, and that doesn't seem right. Maybe that's the point, Sierra said thoughtfully. Maybe the best revenge against people who try to destroy us is finding joy in the life they thought they were ending. As full darkness settled over their ranch, Sierra began to sing, not for an audience or applause, but simply for the pleasure of making music with someone she loved. Her voice rose into the Wyoming night, carrying across the vast landscape like a benediction, a promise that love could triumph over violence and hope could flourish in the most unlikely soil. The song she sang was her own composition, words and melody born from her journey from brokenness to wholeness. I was lost in darkness, voice stolen away, but love found me breathing at the break of day. Now I sing of healing, of hearts made new, of finding forever in morning's dew. Bo listened with the contentment of a man who'd learned that sometimes the greatest victories came not from conquest, but from the simple courage to love completely, despite the risk of loss. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, but they held no threat now, only the promise of rain that would nourish the land and sustain the life they'd built together. The future stretched before them, vast as the Wyoming sky, filled with possibilities they would explore hand in hand, voice raised in harmony with the eternal song of hope made manifest. Their story had begun with a cruel bet and a broken woman delivered like cargo to a lonely man's doorstep. It ended with two whole people who discovered that healing others was the surest path to healing themselves, and that love, real love, was always worth fighting for. The ranch slept peacefully under stars that had witnessed countless stories of struggle and triumph, but few as unlikely or as beautiful as the one that had unfolded within its boundaries. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but Bo and Sierra would face them as they'd learned to face everything else, together, unafraid and certain that their voices would always find harmony in the vast chorus of life itself.